Screenwriting is a kind of portal into what it is to be human. Creativity itself is essential to our humanity, to be able to play with each other, to be able to play with ideas, to be able to play with our experience. That's absolutely part of storytelling. One of the aspects of the craft, learning the craft of storytelling, are techniques, just like a magician, to catch the curiosity of the audience and to manipulate, if you like, their emotions, to deliver a meaning that they weren't quite expecting. So hence the importance of suspense and surprise. To be, overwhelmed by something that we weren't expecting, but when we think about it, has been planted earlier. That's a good way of talking about, some basic craft skills in terms of storytelling, the planned and the payoff. And of course, the three-act structure, which is one of the dominant models out there for feature screenplay writing particularly, which once you learned it, you often wish you hadn't, because it can just confine your imagination and your creativity. But if you use it as a point of reference, of course, we know about beginnings, middles and ends. We know about having to set things up and to introduce people and draw people in. The character arc is another concept that's very much out there, and that's about the way in which a character might change and develop through interaction with the plot as they move through the story. The hero's journey is a very popular one, but again only applies to certain kinds of films, particularly journey films and adventure films. So these concepts are touched upon and explored, but within a much wider context, out of which they've emerged a whole history of dramatic theory and literary theory, but also art, history, architecture, music, all of the arts really feed into cinema. And although story is important, it's not the only element in a film, but we certainly believe that you should understand the craft skills as you move forward as a screenwriter.
What the writer does when they write a script, they think of a character, and that character, depending on who they are and what they want and where they come from, their life experience, will do things to get what they want. That will result in actions. Those actions, when you sum them up, will become the plot. The plot will be written as a story, and the story will eventually become a script. So that's what the writer does. When I come in as a director, I read the script and I work that backwards. I start with the script and figure out what the story is, what it's really about, and through the plot and the actions I figure out who the characters are. So that's my job, to find out who the characters are. So if the script doesn't work, it's usually because the character is doing something they wouldn't do because of who they are. But anyway, when I distill that down, I compare my notes with the producer, and if the producer and I can agree that this story is really exactly about the same thing, then that's a good ground for a collaboration, because you need that kind of common ground and understanding. Otherwise you're making different films, and that's usually a recipe for disaster. So when you go to cast actors, you know your characters so well that when that actor walks in through the door, you know if it's them or not. And it's got nothing to do with looks, it's got nothing to do with anything except who they are and what they project. Because when people watch the film, and they have to know the first time they see a character, they have to understand who they are. So when you cast, that's what you're looking for yourself. I did a film a long time ago called Marooned, and the producer Andrea Calderwood suggested an actor. We met at the BFI, and this actor walked in. I didn't know who he was, and we talked for 15 minutes, and then we all had to go, and then he turned in the door and said, "So do I get the part?" And I said, "Of course I get the part." And this was Robert Carlyle, before he became world famous. Because when you know, you know. And it's the same when you film. If your take is, if it's good, when you do a take, if it's good, you know it's good. If you don't know it's good, then you go again. You never need to discuss it. If it's good, everybody knows. People who walk in through the door after the take will know something good is happening. So that's about trusting your instincts, and that's the hardest thing in life. It's the hardest thing to do, but that's the one thing you have to learn to do as a director, because that's all you got. You have nothing else, because you are the audience.
You are basically the first spectator of the film, and you have to decide what matters to the audience. And certainly when you reach the point of making feature films, you have a lot of help from people who are all experts in their field. So you never feel you would have to tell someone else how to do their job. It's more a case of how can they benefit you in your role as making the best possible film for your audience. Because there's a lot at stake, in terms of money, people's time, the equipment, you have to plan in advance, which means, for example, here's my shot list, or here's my floor plan. Here is where I imagine the camera positions are going to be. But on the day, you always block each scene in advance with the actors, and usually it's just the director and the actor. You have to kind of adapt to what actors' preferences are, because ultimately they're your key storytellers. Of course, the lighting is important, what the camera is doing is important, all these various departmental elements, but ultimately it's the cast that is the key kind of storytelling element, and it's the cast that is what the audience is watching. Much as we like great lighting, it's what's lit that's more important, that kind of carries the story.
When it comes to collaborations between director and composer, and when they first meet or when they first get together over a project, you have to assume that it's tabula rasa. In other words, the composer is starting from a blank slate. And by that stage, you have to also assume that the director knows everything there is to know about their film. In other words, they're kind of the gods of that universe, that film world they're dealing with. In practice, there are often some barriers, because the way that editors edit, they like to use music to edit too. It gives them a sense of pace, timing, rhythm, and so on. And over a period of time, while the film's being edited, the crew get used to hearing that music against that film. Now, music usually, or most commonly, gets composed in post-production, so at the same time as the film's being edited, which is fairly late in the whole process. Occasionally, the collaboration will start very early in the process. Howard Shore, for instance, when he was working with Peter Jackson on The Lord of the Rings, Howard Shore said, I am not doing anything until I've read every word in every novel, which is the way it happened. And he was actually on the project for about 2 years, and then there was The Hobbit on top of that. Interestingly, there's about 21 hours of music for the whole project, which is a massive amount of music for one project. I mean, that's, to give you an example, that would probably equal the entire symphonic output of Beethoven in terms of running time. So it's substantial amounts of music that needs to be written. Some projects require one approach, which is the one I've just described. More commonly, the composer will be contracted early in the project, but the discussions about what isn't appropriate music, what it should be, budget, etc., that discussion actually starts in post-production when there is something to show. Currently, I'm listening a lot to two scores, one by Howard Shore. It's an early Cronenberg film called The Brood. I interviewed Howard Shore quite recently, and this came up in the discussion, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. So it's suddenly become my favourite. And the other one that I've been listening to for a while, which I'm halfway through transcribing, is Psycho, plus LA Confidential. And I think these are important scores in a number of ways. One is because they are in many ways groundbreaking. Psycho because it's a strings-only score to a black and white film, and LA Confidential partly because it's a mixture of different styles. And one of the controversial things, I suppose, not controversial so much as difficult things, is for a score to sound like it all belongs to the same film, because you have too many different styles. There's a danger that it sounds like a collection of stuff that isn't really kind of linear or cohesive. There's a very interesting article that was published in the International Musicians magazine many years ago, which sought to codify the number of common different uses of music, and they came up with 21. In practice, it's probably quite a bit more. But it includes important things, like, for instance, revealing the unspoken thoughts and emotions of a character, stating time period, aligning two narrative themes together, continuity, underlying action, underscoring dialogue. So it's a wide palette. There is a very, very clear example of, for instance, expressing the unspoken thoughts and emotions of a character in a film called Spartacus. Everyone knows the story. It's the story of Spartacus the slave, and when he's actually enslaved, waiting to fight in the arena, there's a scene where he's just sitting very quietly in his cell, and the music is suggesting the dilemma that is in his head or in his heart, and it's the most economic and the most direct way of showing the, if you like, the unspoken or the hidden layer within that character.